Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of True Consequences podcast. I'm Eric Carter-Landin, and your host and co-producer of this series of True Consequences, Ni Una Más, the Women of Juarez. Before we get into the episode, I have a bunch of people I need to thank. I need to thank EMC, Katie S., Brandy D., Chelsea G., Linda L., Jennifer N., Alexandria D., Tosh, Julie M., and Yelena. I need to thank Miss Linz, Lisa A., and Anita Q., all for being my latest patron subscribers. I also need to thank Chelsea G., Lucy H., Emma D., Kate, Ellen, Aaron, Sur, Lisa W., thank you all so much for your generous Ko-Fi donations. If you want to support this show, go to patreon.com/trueconsequences. Patrons get access to ad-free episodes early, as well as behind-the-scenes content and access to research documentation as well. Or you can go to ko-fi.com/trueconsequences. I'm Eric Carter-Landin, and this is True Consequences. This podcast deals with topics and themes which may not be suitable for younger or sensitive audiences. Listener discretion is advised. Between 1993 and 2002, an estimated 2,000 women had been beaten, raped, murdered, and mutilated. And it hasn't stopped yet. The people of Juarez began finding bodies of young women in 1993. The femicide started before that, though. How long before that? No one knows. The chasm between El Paso and Ciudad Juarez was once called El Paso del Norte. In 1821, Mexico won independence from Spain, and this area became part of the Mexican nation. In 1846, a treaty was signed between Mexico and the U.S., and the Rio Grande became the border between the two countries. Ciudad Juarez was named after Benito Juarez. He was a Revolutionary War hero. Juarez was born in 1806 in the village of San Pablo, Huelato, in the state of Oaxaca. He was orphaned at a young age, and he grew up working in the fields. His uncle wanted him to become a priest. The priesthood was the only place that an Indian would be accepted. Later, Juarez went to the capital of Mexico to study theology. Eventually, he became involved in politics and became a lawmaker. He rose to Chief Justice of the Mexican Supreme Court and then became President of the Republic. There is a monument to Benito Juarez that stands in the town plaza in downtown Juarez. This monument serves as a bus stop for the town. Buses run from the center of town to all points outside of town. This monument is where many of these women disappeared. Before the Mexican War of 1846, El Paso and Juarez were one large city, and people crossed the Rio Grande freely to get from one place to another. After the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed, the U.S. and Mexico split the city with the Rio Grande as the border between the two countries. The U.S. and Mexico now share the waters of the Rio Grande through a series of agreements overseen by the joint U.S.-Mexico Boundary and Water Commission. The river is all but dried up now due to drought and overuse. For most of the year, it's no more than a trickle. People dump their trash there on a regular basis, and there are many shanties set up along the banks. People use this area as a place to stay until they can make a break for the U.S. In the 90s, Juarez was growing. American companies were moving their factories out of the U.S. and into countries where labor laws were more lax. The federal minimum wage in the U.S. was $2.30 an hour, but most states had a minimum wage set at $4.30 an hour. In Juarez, people were making about $5 a week. Huge companies like Johnson & Johnson, General Electric, and Briggs & Stratton began manufacturing parts in Mexico. The city was once small, but the arrival of the maquiladoras made jobs plentiful, so people began moving from other parts of Mexico to find work. Juarez was one of the few places in Mexico that was experiencing a growth in the job market in the 90s. Women were preferred as employees since the factory owners could pay them less and they had smaller hands, allowing them the dexterity to put together small parts with ease and efficiency. These maquiladoras produced goods for Fortune 500 American companies. Lear, Amway, TDK, Honeywell, General Electric, 3M, DuPont, and Kenwood were among the American corporations that hired young women to work shifts at the factories in Juarez. The factories ran day shifts and night shifts of 10 to 12 hours per day. Most schools would have morning and evening classes to accommodate the factory workers. Many who moved to Juarez to find work in the factories lived in shanty towns. They would make houses out of whatever materials they could find that had been discarded by others: old tires, cardboard, cinder blocks. They had no running water or electricity in these homes. The roads were unpaved, and going in and out of these communities, many stick-built houses were dilapidated and run down. Entire families would work in the factories in Juarez. Young girls in their teens were especially sought after since they could do the work quickly and didn't expect to be paid much for their labor. Many of the girls who went to work in the factories were under the legal age of 16. These girls would buy falsified documents saying that they were of legal age to work. The town was bustling with nightclubs and bars. These held a steady stream of American partiers, drug dealers, and gang members. The bars in Juarez were particularly attractive to American partiers, since they stayed open all night and sex work was legal for those over 18. Ciudad Juarez is located in the northern state of Chihuahua. By 1990, there were 1.5 million people living in Juarez. Most of the job opportunities were in Juarez, as opposed to El Paso. The U.S.-owned factories provided most of the income for the people of El Paso and Juarez alike. The people of El Paso work in management, while the people of Juarez work on the assembly lines. The increase in the number of factories in Juarez and along the northern border came in 1982 with the devaluation of the peso. By 1986, 94% of factory employment was in the northern border states. The shift in jobs to the industrial sector came after the cancellation of the Bracero program, a U.S. government program that began in the early 1940s to bring a few hundred experienced Mexican agricultural laborers to harvest sugar beets in the Stockton, California area. The program soon expanded to cover most of the U.S. to provide much-needed farm workers for the booming U.S. agricultural sector. But the program was halted in 1964 in response to harsh criticisms of human rights abuses of the Mexican laborers. The following year, the Mexican government implemented the Border Industrialization Program, also known as the Maquiladora Program, to relieve the resulting high unemployment rate. This program used low-wage Mexican labor to entice U.S. manufacturing to the region without tariff consequences, as long as the assembled product was returned to the U.S. for final sale. In exchange, Mexican citizens received salaries that they otherwise wouldn't have had. By 1991, there were almost 700 maquiladoras operating in the Mexican border cities. More than 300 of these were in Juarez alone. Juarez underwent a second transformation in the mid-90s. NAFTA was created, and this led to the largest free trade zone between Mexico, the U.S., and Canada. The pact was signed on December 17, 1992. 3 separate ceremonies were held in 3 capitals. President George H.W. Bush, Mexican President Carlos Salinas, and Canadian Prime Minister Brian Mulroney signed the pact, which eliminated restrictions on the flow of goods, services, and investment within North America. The agreement was formally signed into law on December 8, 1993, by President William Jefferson Clinton, and took effect on January 1, 1994. NAFTA allowed tax breaks to be enjoyed throughout Mexico. The U.S. and Mexican governments anticipated that the provision would entice manufacturers to leave the overstressed border area and expand further into the country. But the maquiladoras stayed on the border. Juarez had the greatest workforce. More than 200,000 people moved to Juarez to work in the factories by 1994. There was no thought or planning to accommodate the influx of workers into Juarez. The treaty created an exemption for foreign companies, which allowed them to not pay local taxes, so the city didn't have funds for basic residential infrastructure. This meant that workers whose wages were already low had to figure out how to pay for the simplest things. Childcare and trash removal were unheard of. Many set up what resembled temporary camps in the foothills surrounding the city. Families crammed into single-room wooden shacks and makeshift homes of cardboard. They had dirt floors, no indoor plumbing or electricity, and badly rutted roads with no sewage systems. Trash was left strewn about in vacant lots. Most of the shanty towns were accessible only on foot. To get to work, young girls had to travel alone, often late at night or in the very early hours of the morning, to the nearest bus stop miles away from their homes. Neighborhoods changed from one block to the next, with sections of paved street regularly giving way to dirt roads. Since drugs were plentiful and sex work was legal, and the cantina stayed open all night, Juarez was a place that many Americans went to find a night of free-spirited fun or trouble, depending on their mood. Many of the clubs hired pretty young girls to dance and serve alcohol. The jobs at the bars often paid more than the maquilladoras. I won't be able to talk about all the women and girls who have been murdered in Juarez, but I think that it's important to tell the stories of some of them so you can get an idea about what's happening there and what's been happening there. One of the first victims was 16-year-old Sylvia Morales. Sylvia disappeared on July 11, 1995. Sylvia was a young, vibrant girl who loved to sing and admired Selena. She was going to a private university where she was studying business administration during the day, and then she worked in a trendy shoe store in the afternoons and evenings. On the day of her disappearance, her mother Ramona was running late to meet her at the bus stop at 8:30 p.m. that night. Sylvia was scheduled to arrive on the 9 p.m. bus after going to school and working all day. During the 36 months prior to Sylvia's disappearance, several women had been brutally assaulted and murdered in Juarez. Ramona and Sylvia were well aware, and Ramona wanted to make sure that her daughter was safe. None of the past murders had been well publicized. They showed up in small articles buried in the pages of the newspaper, but none of them made front-page news. The women had all disappeared on their way from home to work or from work to home. Many of them disappeared in broad daylight. Their bodies would be found weeks or months later in the desert that surrounds the city. The victims' bodies had all been mutilated. They had been raped and beaten. Some were bound with rope or their own shoelaces. Some had been stabbed or shot, but most had been strangled. All the women were young, petite, and pretty. They had long, dark hair, dark eyes, and full lips. They were all from poor families. Most worked at maquilladoras or in shops downtown. Most were students at the university. Some were no more than children. The youngest victim was 5 years old when she was taken, raped, and murdered. The Moraleses rented a small house with plumbing and electricity in the modest community of Nuevo Hipódromo, a colonia on the outskirts of the city. The neighborhood was made up of mostly unfinished cinder block houses. It was a short bus ride away from the downtown district and the factories. Within a year, the family had earned enough money to purchase one of the last pieces of land in the colonia. It was a small lot across the street from an abandoned field owned by the Mexican National Oil Company, Pemex. Sylvia Morales didn't like the bars. She didn't want to work in the factories either. Instead, she chose to work in a shoe store in a nice neighborhood. The store was called Tres Hermanos. Because Sylvia's father was a machinist, she had options. She could be pickier about where she wanted to work. Her brothers also brought money into the house. She was concentrating on her studies because she wanted to find work as an administrator or a teacher, like her brother, Domingo. Sylvia loved to sing. She taught herself the English version of Selena's I Could Fall in Love with You, and would sing it with pride as she went about her morning routine. While she sang in her choir group at church, she preferred to sing pop songs at home. The day she went missing was a strange day. Sylvia's brother gave her a ride to school that morning. He saw her rushing to the bus stop at just before 10 o'clock in the morning with a neighborhood boy. He yelled out to her and offered her a ride. This was supposed to be an easy day for Sylvia. She had a light schedule at school with only one exam to take. Then she would go to the shoe store and work until closing time. Domingo noticed that she was very quiet on the trip to school. This was unusual for Sylvia. He wondered if she had had an argument with her mother that morning. He didn't ask her about it, though. He let his sister out at the Universidad Iberoamericana, a private school where Sylvia was taking classes in business administration. She was to sit for her exam and then go straight to work. The shoe store was located in a touristy part of the city, next to Our Lady of Guadalupe Mission. This was the municipality's oldest surviving church. It was completed in 1868, and it was the first house of worship erected on the border between Mexico and the U.S. In the same square is another church, the Juarez Cathedral, a towering building with a neoclassical facade. It was built in the early 20th century as an annex to the mission to accommodate the rising number of worshippers. Ramona, Sylvia's mother, set out to meet Sylvia's bus that night. The road was dark with few streetlights. A solitary tree marked the bus stop, and Ramona got to the stop just as the first passengers were disembarking. It was 8:45, and Sylvia had told her mother that she would be on the 9 o'clock bus. Sylvia's shift was supposed to end at 8 o'clock that evening. Ramona had often warned her daughter to be careful. She told Sylvia that girls were disappearing, but Sylvia had the confidence that came with youth. She told her mother, "They can't do anything to me." As Ramona stepped up to the bus that arrived just after 9 o'clock that evening, she watched as one by one passengers got off to make their trek home from a long day. But there was no sign of Sylvia. Ramona wasn't worried at that point. She thought that Sylvia had missed her bus. Maybe she stopped to talk with her friends at the bus stop in the plaza. Ramona continued to wait. The 9:15 bus came and went, as did the 9:30 and 10 o'clock buses. She began to worry the later it got, and she began to panic when the 10:30 bus came and went, and still there was no sign of Sylvia. Ramona was desperate to see her daughter. She waited until the 1 a.m. bus came, and still, Sylvia was not on it. This was the last bus of the night. Ramona went home as fast as she could, and once there, she tried to wake her husband Angel. He had lung cancer and was growing increasingly weak, so he wouldn't always wake up once he fell asleep. She decided to run to a neighbor's home and ask for help. Her friend Sandra lived there. Sandra's brother-in-law was a captain in the Juarez Police Department. Sandra immediately called all the hospitals and the Red Cross to ask if Sylvia had been injured or was ill. But Sylvia was not anywhere to be found. She then called her brother-in-law. Quote, "Sylvia Morales is missing," she told him. She asked if he could mobilize a search for her. The captain knew Sylvia from the neighborhood and the shoe store. Ramona thought that she could trust the captain since he knew Sylvia. She went home to wait. She sat by the phone for hours, but no one called. Missing people were rarely given much attention in Juarez. One of the main reasons for this was that missing people were often from families that were not local. They were people who had come to Juarez to find work, but weren't necessarily invested in the community. Another reason was that the police force in Juarez were some of the lowest paid in Mexico. This attracted the least desirable candidates. Only an elementary school education was required to be a police officer in Juarez. The force had no investigative power. This meant that they were strictly preventative in nature, and it was believed that because of the low wages, many police officers were corrupt and accepted bribes from cartels to help support their families. That, or they were working for the cartels to begin with and had taken the job to earn a little side money while assisting drug dealers and helping them make a profit. Those who actually wanted to help the community were often forced out of the occupation, or they quit out of frustration. We're going to take a quick break. Ramona remembered the morning of her daughter's disappearance. Sylvia hadn't eaten very much of her breakfast and seemed nervous and distracted. Ramona thought at the time that Sylvia was nervous about her exam. Ramona was forced to start her own investigation. The police were not interested in helping her. She went to the shoe store that Sylvia worked at to ask some questions about her daughter's day. The store manager told Ramona and Angel that Sylvia had been in the store on that day, but she had asked permission to leave at 12:30 p.m. to take a second exam at school. Sylvia said she would be back by 3 o'clock. Sylvia never returned to the store. Ramona checked with the school administration to see if Sylvia was sitting for another test and was told that the one exam she had taken that morning was the only one that she was scheduled to take. The story didn't make sense to Ramona. Sylvia was not a liar. She'd always been truthful. Sylvia was a good girl. Ramona went back home to wait and see if Sylvia would show up. But Angel and Sandra, the neighbor, went to file a missing persons report at the police station. It was election day in Juarez, so the police would be of little help. All the administrative offices were closed, and on top of that, police required a minimum 72 hours before they would file a missing persons report. The officer behind the counter told Angel and Sandra that Sylvia had probably run off with a boy and that she would turn up somewhere eventually. He dismissed the idea that she had met with foul play, even though women had been going missing from Juarez for months. Ramona continued to investigate Sylvia's disappearance on her own. She went to 2 of the local nightclubs to see if anyone there had seen or heard from Sylvia. One of the women in the neighborhood would chaperone young girls to the nightclubs so they could go dancing. Sylvia had gone along on a few occasions. Remember this. It's important. One girl in the neighborhood recalled seeing Sylvia on the afternoon of her disappearance. She said she had seen Sylvia waiting for a bus at the statue of Benito Juarez. The girl said that she had spotted Sylvia, but Sylvia didn't greet her like she normally did. Quote, "She didn't greet me like she always did. I talked to her. She didn't talk back. She was very pensive, like distracted." End quote. The girl told Sylvia's mother that she noticed that Sylvia was with a chero, a cowboy. The man was dressed all in black and he was speaking English. While many of the men in Juarez wore cowboy hats and pointed-toe boots, it was unusual to see a man dressed in all black in the summer heat. What was more unusual was that the man was speaking English. I wouldn't be able to tell you if he was really a friend, the girl told Ramona, or if he was with her because, like I told you, she looked like she had a lot on her mind, and she did seem very distant. She wasn't talking to me at all, but the man seemed to be speaking with Sylvia. End quote. The girl then told Ramona that Sylvia had gotten on a bus that went to Valle de Juarez. The bus took passengers to Juarez Porvenir Highway, a much more prosperous neighborhood than her own. The man had gotten on the bus with Sylvia. The day after Sylvia's disappearance, the phone rang at the Morales residence and Ramona answered, but there was no one on the line. Ramona asked, "Is it you, my daughter? If you left with a boy, we forgive you. Just come back." There was no response. On the 14th, Ramona went to the state attorney general's office to report Sylvia missing. She wanted to speak to the officers about her daughter's disappearance. She would be speaking with the state police since the local police were not trained to investigate criminal activity. All missing persons were to be reported to Chihuahua State Police. She was given a number and told to wait. She waited for quite a while, and her number was finally called. The officer barely acknowledged her as she told her story. She told him all about how Sylvia had gone to school to sit for an exam. Then she went to work, but she never returned from her job at the shoe store. The officer asked her if Sylvia had a boyfriend. Ramona gave the name of a young man in the neighborhood. The officer then asked if she went to the bars frequently. Ramona told him that she didn't. She was focused on her studies in school. The officer then asked how Sylvia dressed. Quote, "Does she wear miniskirts?" End quote. Ramona was angry by this time. She told him that Sylvia was wearing jeans and a rose-colored blouse and white tennis shoes when she went missing. The policeman laughed at Ramona and told her that Sylvia had probably run off with some guy. It was no secret that the police would blame the victims when they heard about a missing woman. They would be flippant and offensive. State police officers were better educated than local police, but they were still underpaid. Corruption among the ranks was rumored to be rampant. Women's rights activists began voicing their outrage about missing and murdered women at this time. They were angry that detectives were faulting the victims of the murders. Implications that the women willingly went off with their killers and that they were leading double lives. Factory workers and students by day and sex workers by night. And these claims angered the mothers and activists in the community. The majority of the missing girls had been wearing long pants and sneakers. They were abducted on their way to or from work. In the machismo Mexican culture, women who were out by themselves were frowned upon. They were often seen as promiscuous. Activists believed that this mindset had driven the officials to overlook the growing number of poor Mexican girls whose violated, butchered bodies had been turning up in the desert. There was also speculation that the police were somehow in on the murders. Either they were abducting and murdering the girls themselves, or were helping somebody else do it. This could be simply covering up for the ones who were guilty. The officer gave Ramona a clipboard with a paper to fill out for missing persons. Her neighbor Sandra helped her fill it out. Ramona was still hopeful that this was the first step to finding her daughter. Instead, police told her to keep investigating Sylvia's disappearance on her own. They told her that if she got any leads, she should contact the police. Isn't this supposed to work the other way around? In the days that followed Ramona's trip to the state police office, more calls came to the house. One male caller claimed that he knew where Sylvia was. He gave Ramona an address. The entire family went to the address to see if Sylvia was there. Sylvia's brother Domingo went into the house, but found only an elderly woman lived there. The woman didn't know anything about Sylvia. The family reported the lead to the police, along with another lead they had gotten from a man claiming that a factory worker named Alejandro knew where Sylvia was. The police assured the family that they were following up on all the leads that came their way, but the family never heard from the police about any of the leads. It was the 19th of August when Ramona learned that a body had been found not far from her home on Casa Grande's highway. The girl was found with long, dark hair. The girl had been raped and strangled. Her remains had been dumped in a vacant lot that belonged to Pemex. She learned through neighborhood talk that this was not Sylvia, but the police did not give her any information. 2 months after Sylvia disappeared, her mangled body was found in a secluded stretch of desert east of the airport. This area was called Lote Bravo. The rancher who found Sylvia was out there on horseback looking for wild horses when he came upon her body hidden in some brush. Sylvia was partially naked. Her blouse and bra had been pulled up above her breasts. Her breasts had been mutilated. Beside her body, carefully folded, were a pair of white underwear and her white tennis shoes. The police cordoned off the area and began an investigation. More than 40 women had been murdered in the same way that year alone. The police had few leads and 0 suspects. Forensic pathologist Irma Rodriguez of the Chihuahua State Attorney General's office came to the scene to collect evidence. Dr. Rodriguez was saddened by the number of bodies turning up in remote areas of Juarez, and while she could determine the cause of death of the young woman, she couldn't figure out who was behind the murders. Sylvia had defensive wounds on her right arm. She had fought fiercely against her attackers, to no avail. The autopsy revealed that she had been raped and strangled with her own shoelaces. Her right breast had been cut off, while the nipple of her left breast had been bitten off. Dr. Rodriguez found sand underneath her fingernails. This gave rise to the thought that Sylvia had been alive after the attack and left in the desert to die. On September 2nd, around 10 a.m., the police came to the Morales residence. They told Ramona that they found Sylvia, but they gave no details. Ramona mistakenly thought that they found Sylvia alive. The officers didn't tell her any different. They only asked to see one of Sylvia's shoes. Ramona gave them the shoe. They looked at it and handed it back. They asked that she come with them to the police station. Ramona's oldest son, Francisco, was in the kitchen. He came into the living room to find out what was going on. He offered to go to the station with his mother, but police refused to allow him to come. They insisted that Ramona go with them alone. The officer told Francisco that he would bring his mother home in a few hours. When police took her to the morgue, they showed her Sylvia's skull. Ramona collapsed on the floor of the morgue, unable to process that this was all that remained of her daughter. Even after police showed Ramona that the blouse that Sylvia had been wearing, Ramona was unable to reconcile that this was her daughter. She wanted to believe that Sylvia was off somewhere alive and well and singing like Selena. To add insult to injury, the police didn't bring Ramona home that day. They left her to fend for herself without any money to get a bus. She had to beg for bus money to get home, and when she got there, she had to explain to her husband and her sons what had happened to Sylvia. Sylvia would never come home. 8 days later, the body of Olga Alicia Perez was found in Lote Bravo, the same place that Sylvia had been found. She had been tortured the same way that Sylvia had. She had been raped, her right breast had been cut off, and her left nipple had been bitten off. Her hands had been tied with a belt and her neck was broken. 6 more bodies would be found over the next few days, all in the same place, with the same brutal injuries. And by the winter of 1995, 19 young women had been killed. This brought the total number of victims to 45. Olga Alicia Carrillo Perez had disappeared from the shoe store that she worked at about a month before her body was found. The store that Olga worked at was not far from the one that Sylvia had worked at. Olga was not found by police as part of an organized search. Her body was found by a passerby some distance off the airport delivery highway, in a remote area of Lote Bravo known as Zacate Blanco. Olga was one of 8 girls to be found along the same stretch of desert over the next 4 months. The bodies were not buried in the desert, they were just left out for others to find. The families of the missing women felt that the killer was taunting them, daring them to find him and do something about it. It was as if he was telling them that he would never be caught and would continue to kill. The bodies decomposed quickly. Temperatures in the summer reached around 110 degrees. During the winter, wildlife would come and feed on the bodies. Olga had been missing barely a month, but the skull was so deteriorated that the coroner had to hold it together so that Olga's mother could identify her daughter by her jaw. Olga's mother, Irma, had to ultimately identify her daughter by the blouse that had been found near her body. Irma was still reluctant to believe that this was the body of her only child. Irma was told that there was not enough genetic material to conduct a DNA test. She was asked to simply trust the officials that this was her daughter. The bones looked like the body had been out in the desert much longer than Olga had been missing. Irma didn't have the financial means to seek outside help to prove that this was not her daughter, so she had to accept that it was. After the loss of her only child, Irma suffered a stroke and was not doing well. But that didn't stop her from becoming an activist for the Women of Juarez. She would keep newspaper clippings about all the murdered women. She would spread them out on her bed every night looking for clues and similarities between the women. She was determined to find her daughter's killer. Irma's story was very similar to Ramona's. Both had gone to the police right away and were told to wait 72 hours. Then Irma, like Ramona, was told to conduct her own search investigation and let police know if she found any leads. Irma had found that Olga had gone to the local headquarters of the reigning political party, El Partido de Acción Nacional. The leader of PAN, Francisco Barrio Terranzas, was in office as governor of Chihuahua when the women first started going missing in 1993. He and his administration had been tasked with looking into the murders. By 1995, his term was ending and he still had no answers for what was happening to the women in Juarez. The party wanted to stay in power in Chihuahua, and they were holding dances to promote the party and fund other events. The opposing party, El Partido Revolucionario Institucional, was led by Patricio Martinez. The party had been in power in Mexico nationally for over 70 years. A woman had come to the Perez house to ask Olga if she would like to come to the dance. The woman claimed to be a chaperone. Olga wasn't interested in going out. She was serious about her studies and was about to begin classes at a local university where she had been granted a partial scholarship. Irma had pushed Olga to go out and have a little fun. Irma also pushed Olga to quit her job at the shoe shop in order to find work closer to home. Irma didn't like her daughter taking the bus from Juarez to the rural community where they lived after dark. On August 10th, Olga was supposed to have a short workday. She agreed to go to the shop to train her replacements on her day off. She told her mother that she would be home by 6 that evening. When Olga didn't show up, Irma went looking for her immediately. Some neighborhood people told Irma that they had seen Olga at the PAN rally at the political headquarters earlier that day. Olga had met a boy at the first dance that she had gone to, and since then, she and her chaperone were becoming regulars at the headquarters. Irma had gone to the police headquarters with this information and was stunned when officers laughed at her and told her that 20-year-old Olga had run off with some boy and would be back in her own good time. Irma was determined to find her daughter, so she found a legal aid advisor named Rogelio Loya. He accompanied Irma back to the police station. As was so often the case, when someone was seen as an authoritative figure was involved, police paid more attention to the missing person. They were more respectful to Loya, but they still didn't do much to find Olga. Irma continued her own investigation by finding phone numbers of the families of missing girls, and she was horrified to learn that most of the parents she talked to had found their daughters deceased. Irma then went to the PAN headquarters to see if she could find help there. She tried asking questions of the group, but they were uncooperative. Irma found a former night watchman for the building, and he answered some of her questions. The man broke down when he told Irma that Olga had been brought to the PAN headquarters by another female employee of the shoe store. He told Irma that he thought it was strange that the employee would drive so far out of her way to drop Olga off at headquarters. The woman lived more than 40 minutes away from the offices on the opposite side of town. The night watchman resigned shortly after Olga's disappearance. The legal aid Loya ghosted Irma shortly after the visit to the PAN offices. Rumor had it that he had been threatened by someone. Irma never found out who, and after her stroke became too ill to follow up on any more leads. Irma had also gotten an anonymous call shortly after Olga's disappearance. The caller claimed to know where Olga was being held. He gave an address, and Irma's sister went to investigate. She posed as a social worker and went to the address on Fraccionamiento Almita. The house seemed to be a daycare center. It was full of children, and of course, Olga was not there. And no one living there knew who she was. Irma would go to the morgue every day to see if there had been any word about her daughter. And then about a month after Olga's disappearance, news came. No one had called her to let her know that they had found Olga. Irma just showed up as part of her daily ritual. Irma was also told that there was not enough material to perform a DNA test on the body, so she would just have to take the word of the authorities that the bones they had been shown belonged to Olga. Officials told Irma that many of the victims had been leading double lives. By now you know this story. Students and shoe workers by day, sex workers by night. They told her this as some kind of consolation, insinuating that Olga got what she asked for. Many of the victims at this point had been very young girls, no more than children. Some as young as 8. The officers told Irma that these children, while not leading double lives, were raised by bad parents, so they were left to the streets. Irma later found out that the woman who had taken Olga to PAN headquarters on the day that she went missing was friends with the detectives assigned to Olga's case. Olga and Sylvia were the only women to be befriended by older women posing as chaperones for dances. Irma would find out later that this was a common occurrence just before women would go missing. It was rumored that these women were befriending girls and then taking them to be sex trafficked. There were various reports of women going missing while waiting in line for a job at any of the maquilladoras. Several women who were waiting for work had reported there were men from the factories taking their pictures. They were told that this was part of the interview process. There were also reports of these women going missing and turning up murdered. There were stories of men driving around neighborhoods taking pictures of women living there. Officials were still unable to stop the murders. They had no leads and no suspects. Between the months of August and November of 1995, the bodies of 7 young women were recovered from Lote Bravo, the same place that Olga and Sylvia were found. 4 had been raped, stabbed, and strangled. All of them were found with their right breast severed, and the left nipple bitten off, and their necks broken. 2 more young women were found not far from Lote Bravo, in the fields behind Pimex. One was a 14-year-old girl named Isela Tena Quintanilla. The other was 17-year-old Elizabeth Castro. Both of these girls had their hands tied behind their backs with rope that was knotted in the same fashion. Next time on Ni Una Más, the story of the women of Juarez. Thanks for listening and stay safe, New Mexico.